So our next speaker is Zoe Goodacre. Zoe is one of our graduate students now on the second year of our advanced specialist diploma course. And we had a retreat last summer, a masterclass or summer intensive that some of you came in at the tail end of when you attended our conference last year. But we had a session on developing cultural competencies. What would be cultural competencies. So that is what Zoe's going to speak on behalf of a group that they've been working with. And it's going to be very interesting.
As you will have already heard, I am Zoe Goodacre. My pronouns are they, them. I am a... What am I? What am I even doing here? I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor working with predominantly GSRD people. But I also have a special interest in working with neurodivergent people. And as you'll have heard this morning in the workshop, there's a fairly big crossover there. I'm also autistic myself, and that, I think, has steered the way that I've come into practice and having this as a special interest. Now, when I started this presentation, in fact, when I started this work in general, we were looking at this in terms of a process of developing guidelines on cultural competence with working with ADHD and autistic clients. But as this is still work in progress, I'm going to change the title of this presentation at the outset to take out the word competence and replace it instead with attunement. So here's a little bit about my plan for today, what I'm going to cover. I'll do some definition of terms. Some of this will be really familiar to you already. I was sat there mentally checking off boxes in my head of things that the panel have already discussed today. So apologies where these things already overlap. I'm going to be talking about the culture that is emerging around ADHD and autism. And I'm going to be considering whether work around competence or attunement is something that we need for ADHD and autistic people. The purpose of this session is to make a case for working differently with this population of clients and to let you know about the work that my colleagues and I have undertaken to date on understanding culture as it relates to this group of clients in therapy, and also to invite some further discussion from you here. I am going to leave time for comments and questions at the end. But one of the things I'd like to do, if we have enough time, is to just give you a minute or two to talk amongst yourselves, because sometimes the hands that go up are, oh my God, I really need to say something about this. So I'm going to try and give a little pause so that you can sort of get that out of your systems a little bit. I'd also like you to think about the questions and comments that you're making before you make them. So if you want to tell me I'm great, or if you want to tell me that I'm wrong, please feel free to come and find me in the breaks. I'm going to be around all day. I also have cards with my contact details on if you want to have those because it's easier for you to formulate questions in an email format. You'll be really welcome to do that. I will also have my email address coming up at the end, so for people who are in the online audience, if they want to message me, my details are there and you're welcome to get in contact with me. The other thing I'd like to do is try to prioritize hearing from people whose voices aren't as privileged or prioritized in settings like this. So when you're thinking about throwing your hand up and asking a question, just have a little look around you and think, am I one of the people who quite often speaks at conferences like this? And if so, maybe just hang back a little bit and give some other people the chance to speak. So one of the questions that I've been asked a few times since starting on this work is, why focus on ADHD and autism specifically, rather than on neurodivergence generally or neurodiversity in totality? As Dominic said, this is a conversation that started last year at the Pink Therapy big event. I ran a workshop there and there were about 20 to 25 of us who had some conversations about cultural competence as it relates to neurodivergence. And we agreed to narrow down to ADHD and autism for several reasons. Much as we understand the trans umbrella that you can see on the left of your screen here, I'm trying to work out which is left and right when it's behind me. As you can see with the trans umbrella, it covers a range of different experiences, and I'm sure that a lot of us will recognize the fact that if you are setting up services to work with people who are thinking about socially, medically, surgically transitioning, that might look quite different than if you are working with someone who is performing drag, for example, or is a cis person who is a bit gender non-conforming in their appearance. Likewise, as we can see on the right of the slide here, services for people who have acquired neurodivergence, such as an acquired brain injury, or for people who are dyslexic or dyspraxic, might look quite different to the services that we would want to have for people with ADHD. One of the things that stood out to us as the group of people meeting at the Pink Therapy Big event was the cultural aspects of neurodivergence that particularly mark out autism and ADHD. I'm going to come on to talk about that in some detail in the preceding few slides, but as a way into this way of thinking, consider the difference between ADHD or autism with, for example, dyslexia or dyspraxia. There's quite a big overlap in terms of dyslexic and dyspraxic experiences with ADHD and autistic experiences. However, I mean, I may be wrong and I'm very happy to be corrected, but I'm not really aware of dyslexic culture or dyspraxic culture in the same way as ADHD and autistic culture feels quite tangible now. The specific elements that are common to ADHD and autism are why we've kind of pulled out those two experiences specifically. And I'm going to come on to describe some of those. But, you know, for myself personally, and I think I can speak for the group that I'm working with, we agree that we should be trying to make therapy accessible to people of all neurotypes. At the same time, there is evidence emerging and growing stronger now that particularly autistic people are having a really hard time of accessing talking therapies and psychological therapies. The experiences of ADHD therapy are a little bit harder to get hold of, and I did do a literature search on this, but what I am finding is some evidence from studies that are showing that ADHD people respond better to modified therapies rather than as they were originally manualized. The overlap, the culture clash that we have with ADHD and autistic culture clashes with the culture of a lot of the way that therapy is delivered. And I'm going to try and pull out some of those elements as I'm going through the talk. So this is one of the areas where I am referring to something that's been discussed already by the panel that preceded me. Although this is specifically about working with ADHD and autistic people, there is a significant overlap with gender, sexuality, and relationship divergent experiences as well. As you can see from the references that I've got on the slide here, autistic people's experience of gender and sexual diversity is high. And there has been some research that has been done that shows ADHD people are more than twice as likely as non-ADHD people in the same study cohort to be bisexual. And also, they report higher rates of out-of-control sexual behavior. One key difference that I can see with therapy for ADHD and autistic people and the difference between that and GSRD therapy can be pathologization. Now, especially in terms of the conversations that we've had this morning about the UKCP actions, I am not going to claim that we are out of the woods yet in terms of the pathologization of trans and also sexuality divergent experiences. But whilst homosexuality has been taken out of the DSM, Autism and ADHD are still firmly in the big book of diagnoses, and a lot of the way that people relate to these experiences are through the medical model. Although some people are starting to do some of that reclaiming now and building that culture that I'm going to go on to describe, there is still that tendency for a lot of people to see it as deficit rather than difference, and the medical model is still at the center of that. So I've talked a bit about, referred to ADHD and autism culture. But what is a culture? What does it consist of? I'm not going to read out this whole quote because you can read it yourselves, hopefully. But I am going to pull out some elements from this quote to illustrate some of the ways that ADHD and autism is starting to form a culture of its own. I'm going to look at, for example, thinking styles is a very obvious one, but some of the ways that ADHD and autistic people eat, the ways that we dress, the ways that we understand things like the passage of time can start to form the basis of what I would consider to be ADHD and autistic culture. I think looking at it in a cultural sense also starts to shift the paradigm from that medical model. And again, very timely in terms of the conversations that we've had this morning about the UKCP, I think it helps us to move away from conversion-adjacent practices of trying to make people behave more neurotypically to understanding this as a cultural difference and making space for that in therapy. Referring to some of the kind of crossover here in terms of the GSRD and the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The evidence base that is behind that. I think that some of that could be applied across to ADHD and autism as well. From a minority stress perspective, it can really help to foster a positive valence towards somebody's identity and way of being. And also, there was some conversation at the panel this morning about labeling. Having those labels or descriptive words for experiences can also help people to seek out supportive community, which we know is a really strong protective factor. If we were to apply the lens of social safety theory, ADHD and autistic people have a particular experience of social safety and threat. And it's also worth thinking about, and I don't think this research has been done yet, the way that different thinking styles for autistic and ADHD people impacts on their psychological mediation of stresses. Making therapy about helping people to find social safety in an accepting culture, understanding themselves and their identity in their neurodivergence, can be a really important therapeutic outcome in itself. It feels really important to identify ADHD and autistic culture because, as one of my colleagues on the group that we're working in said, it feels like such a phenomenon. Those of us who are regular users of social media of various kinds will be aware to a greater or lesser extent of ADHD TikTok and Instagram and Facebook groups and Tumblr communities that are creating and sharing relatable content that is helping to start forming that culture and bonding people across their experiences. Alex mentioned this morning about what in my mind I've kind of talked of as diagnosed by memes. And that is a really big part of how autistic people are reaching out and ADHD people are reaching out to find that community. I think I may have skipped a slide here. I did. So whilst I don't necessarily consider the emergence of scholarly journals to be the arbiter of whether or not something is a culture, the fact that there is now a peer-reviewed journal on autistic culture and the fact that it's coming out quarterly suggests that there is sufficient material out there on the emergence of autistic culture particularly to give enough material for that to keep on printing. So today I'm going to focus on 4 components that I'm going to call the kind of core elements of ADHD and autistic culture. And the first of these is sensory differences. Arguably, just about everybody will have an experience to a greater or lesser extent of some of these senses. And again, I find it really interesting to draw the parallel with some people who don't have some of these senses, for example, blind and deaf people, who also have their own culture, who have developed their own languages and ways of communicating. In the case of ADHD and autistic people, sensory differences can tend towards one end of the spectrum or the other. And again, the panel this morning was talking about those spiky profiles of someone being quite hyposensitive in some areas and quite hypersensitive in others. I was thinking about this in terms of how this presents in a cultural way, and linking back to the earlier quote, this is starting to be noticeable in kind of cultural styles of dress. So you might notice people wearing loop earplugs. I have some in my pocket. Or you will find people out wearing noise-cancelling headphones to be able to deal with what can be quite a sensorily overloading experience of being in public. You might notice that some people are wearing sunglasses indoors to deal with, bright fluorescent lighting. There's a specific kind of idea in ADHD culture, specifically around dopamine dressing, the idea of like bright flamboyant colors and clashing prints and things that feel really, affirming and exciting. I have some issues about the dopamine discourse, but I think that is a particularly noticeable part of ADHD and autistic, kind of styles of dress. The concept of same food, which if you're not familiar with it, is the idea of seeking out things that you're familiar with, that are going to be routinely, palatable and acceptable, I would argue, is ADHD and autistic culture around food. Another thing about the kind of spiky profile aspect of the kind of sensory profiles for ADHD and autistic people is lots of us are more able to tolerate high levels of sensory input if we're the ones making them. So this can be quite confounding to kind of neuronormative people to have someone go, I can't stand repetitive noises, or I hate loud noises, I can't stand it. And then the person who's just said that will be sat there casually clicking their pen, or will be engaging in echolalia and repeating words out loud in order to kind of soothe themselves. But for us, it feels like control over our sensory environment rather than the senses themselves is a really important part of helping us to feel comfortable and safe. The next element of ADHD and autistic culture I'm going to focus on is stimming. And this one is an experience that has been a particular target of conversion practices. There have been attempts for a lot of people, and particularly younger people, where healthcare providers, educators, families have tried to stop autistic and ADHD people from performing behaviors that they find weird or annoying. ADHD and autistic people may have been on the receiving end of various ways to try and confine their behavior in this way. But we need to do these things to regulate ourselves and our emotions. Not being able to do these things can cause a lot of distress. And even if those, whether it is like deliberate ways to try and curb this behavior or social sanctions that are coming up that make people feel uncomfortable, even if you can manage to cure, in inverted commas, someone's visible stims, that doesn't necessarily mean that they go away. I've spoken to a few people who are survivors of applied behavior analysis, which a lot of people in autistic communities will refer to as conversion practice, because it is. And some of these people report that because of needing to get rid of visible stems, one person was saying that they clench and unclench their jaw. And as a result, they now have chronic headaches and report very worn teeth because they grind their teeth together until they squeak. Another person talked about how they were punished for bouncing their leg and would be sometimes physically punished for doing this. And to divert that stim into something that was less visible, they clench and unclench their butt cheeks whilst they're sat down, which has shortened the muscles so much in their bum and the backs of their legs that they now get chronic back pain. As I said, even people who haven't suffered overt conversion practices might still find it uncomfortable to stim because of the rejection and the kind of social sanctions that come around stimming in places where people can see you. I would again argue that ADHD and autistic culture is making space for stimming. And to link back to the previous slide on sensory differences, where somebody has a need to stim that clashes with somebody else's need to not have that sensory input right now, thank you very much, it feels like there is a lot more negotiation of that, okay, well, what can you do? Can you divert that? Could you do it differently? Is it okay if I go and do it over here? So there is a lot more of that and an open dialogue about what that might look like for people. I'm going to come on to this one, body-focused stims, because this is another one that can be quite contentious. It is... It's one that comes with a bunch of additional pathologizing labels. So sometimes it gets labeled as self-harm. You have, for example, trichotillomania and dermatillomania for the skin picking or the hair pulling that some people will do. And it feels like having an understanding of this, stimming as a cultural need and something that people need to regulate themselves is a good way of moving towards conversion or moving away from conversion adjacent practices. So asking someone what they get out of it, when you pick your skin or when you pull your hair, does that feel problematic to you? Is it a behavior that you want to stop? Would you like to do something else? If it's an adaptive coping strategy and somebody isn't that bothered about it, then trying to stop them because the people around them don't like the sight of ragged fingernails or, find it distressing to watch them pulling their hair. It feels like it is a much more affirming practice to work with someone to work out what it is they want to get out of this and what it is they do get out of it, rather than just going, well, that's something we have to stop right now because that's dermatillomania and you need to stop doing it. The other thing, and this is the last one on this, that's important to recognize is that applying the neuroconformist norms of stillness in a therapeutic setting and then expecting them to do the often emotionally intense work of therapy could be counterproductive and at worst quite harmful to the clients that you're trying to work with. So the next bit I'm going to move on to is neurodivergent time, or as Marta Rose from Divergent Design Studios calls it, neuroemergent time. I work with so many autistic people who find the disruption of their routines and lack of predictability incredibly stressful. And then on the other hand, I've got autistic people who need the novelty and struggle with the kind of chromonormative 9-to-5 consistent productivity that a lot of particularly workplaces will insist on. The diagram that you've got here, it's a screenshot, so it's a picture. But in the original, it's an animation, and this little tiny blob that you can see here goes around and around this loop. And in the circle at the bottom, that light flares and burns really brightly. And then for the rest of it, it's just kind of quietly spinning out around the top of the loop. Marta Rose calls it gathering stardust, that kind of need to take some time out after that intensely focused period of activity in order to recover. Another aspect of the kind of neuronormative versus neurodivergent experience of time also feels like in some ways it can be compared to the difference between heteronormative versus queer time. So life experiences and milestones could be, could happen in a different way or in a different order for neurodivergent people. There's also the kind of late diagnosis or late recognition of neurodivergence as well that could work similarly in terms of kind of late recognition or acceptance of queer identity, where having a cultural awareness of how that can affect people might help to make the space for integrating, reviewing your life under a different lens of neurodivergence in the same way as reevaluating your life experiences going, oh, and I was queer all along, or I was non-binary all along, can help people get a different understanding of where they've come from. It honestly feels like queerness and neurodivergence in terms of time has a lot of overlap in a lot of different ways. But that's pretty much all I have time for today. But if anybody's interested in doing any research, I'd be really happy to read it. Moving on to this in terms of the culture clash between ADHD and autistic culture and the culture of therapy. The quotes that you see on the screen here were from a study that was done by the Autistic Mutual Aid Society, Edinburgh, into specifically autistic people's experiences in therapy. And it found that chrononormativity in therapy was something that autistic people really struggled with. So for some people, it can take a while to find a comfortable groove with a therapist. And that can be a real problem if you're working to a limited session model and it takes 8 out of 10 of your sessions for the neurodivergent person in front of you to actually feel comfortable to engage with you. Having enough time in sessions themselves to warm up can also be really important. It's quite difficult for a lot of people to come into a session and just kind of drop their baggage and go, right, this is what we're talking about today. And if you're working to an hour or 50 minutes, that can be really difficult for people because you're kind of cramming the emotionally intense stuff towards the end of a session, which can leave people quite dysregulated. There's also that kind of sense of having longer sessions, and we've got that there. One of the other things I find is that with ADHD people particularly, because they have such a kinetic thinking style, they need to go off and wander all around the houses in order to come back to a point, and not being able to do that can feel really constraining. Both ADHD and autistic people may struggle with fixed sessions for different reasons. But one of the things that I've heard from clients is that therapists who insist on a weekly sessional model, they really struggle with that, or some people do, because it's not allowing them the mental and emotional processing time to understand what they're learning about themselves in therapy to then come and build on it at further sessions. So the last element of culture that I'm going to talk about is communication, and I'm sure that everybody is aware that this is a really fundamental part of the therapy process. These quotes, again, are from the Autistic Mutual Aid Society Edinburgh study, and it shows some of the really important elements of communication in therapy that need to be different for ADHD and autistic people. There are some well-known stereotypes about autistic communication, about it being, autistic people are blunt. They don't understand metaphor. They have a really flat affect. That is true for some people, but it's not true of everyone. And I find that for some of my autistic clients particularly, hitting on the right metaphor can make something click in a way that just talking about it logically and rationally does not. The researchers found that autistic people often feel misunderstood in therapy. And that really hinders their ability to benefit from attending. Likewise, ADHD people can struggle with communications in sessions because, as I previously mentioned, that kinetic non-linear thinking style can lead to a lot of, what seems like wandering off the point. And I've had lots of ADHD clients that I work with apologize to me repeatedly for, oh, you're going to have to keep me on track. I'm so sorry, I can't focus on a single thread. And they're apologizing, but also some of their greatest insights come from a conversation that's full of digressions. I think we touched on this a little bit in the panel as well this morning, but having alternative methods of communication can also be really helpful. There's a couple of things that we've got up here where you've got somebody saying that their positive experience came with art therapy. You've got somebody who's talking about having puppets to sort of externalize things and put that degree of distance has been helpful to allow them to process their feelings in a different way. But also having alternative modes of communication can be helpful as well. Situational mutism is a lot more common amongst neurodivergent people and autistic people particularly. So being able to switch to a written form, having a chat box open or doing email therapy, if that is something that you can do, can be really helpful. One of the other things that some of my autistic clients will also say is that they really struggle to remember the content of sessions. So I've said to them, well, I always make a note of what we talk about after the session. Do you want me to email it to you? Because there is this whole thing about, ooh, the notes are secret and we keep them to ourselves. But no, I just write the notes in the sense of today we talked about this is what you said, so that they can then go and refer back to that. One of the really important things that I think all of you will already be aware of, but I don't think it can be stated strongly enough, is that the norms of body language that we are taught in a lot of therapy training does not work with ADHD and autistic people. It's really important as well to think about how the way that we use body language can impact differently on people from all kinds of different cultural backgrounds. So that could be nationality, it could be religious group, it could be racial or ethnic background. And what we really need to think about is what we consider are the normal ways of communicating might not be the norm for the person that we're working with. And that kind of brings me onto the concept of cultural competence. This was a term that was coined in the late 1980s with a group of researchers who were looking for better ways to provide mental health care to First Nations people. And the authors were saying that people should be developing an awareness of one's own worldview and examining your own attitudes towards cultural differences. Understanding where culture clashes can cause difficulties in the relationship, which they described as the dynamics of difference, and then adapting your services to accommodate these differences. So that brings me on to where we're at as a group, looking at cultural competencies for ADHD and autism. As a group, we are a small self-selected group. Many of us who were at the Pink Therapy session last summer that I already mentioned, and a few that we kind of added along the way. The work started off with identifying a meta model of cultural competence, which is the references there, and I can provide my references to anybody who wants them as well. And also looking at the existing ADHD and autism guidelines that there were for practice at the moment. There's the National Autistic Society and the BPS have got some guidance about working with autistic people particularly. And that was one of the gaps that we noticed, is that there is not a lot out there for working with ADHD in therapy. A lot of it is focused on autism. We also had a look at some cultural competency sets for other areas of practice. So Meg John Barker wrote some great GSRD therapy guidelines for the BACP. And we also had to look at the Tashra kink competencies as a framework for looking at working with cultural competence with a minoritized population. The next step was that we drafted an outline document, which was broadly based on the Tashra guidelines. And then, somewhat belatedly, and kind of to my shame, because I was the person who was sort of steering this work, we reflected on the membership of our group and had to think about whose voices weren't present in the conversation. And we very quickly realized that we were all white, all British, no, British and American, and that we were all either non-binary or cis women. So once we realized that, we agreed that we would pause the work that we were doing, invite some more people to join us, and bear in mind the fact that we might need to scrap all of this and start again from the beginning, rather than impose that on some different people who might come along and join us at a later point in the process. As a result of broadening our group, we very quickly shifted the perspective on the work that we're doing. We're really fortunate that Myra Khan has been able to join the group, and she came in and very quickly shook up our thinking about how we were approaching the idea of cultural competence. She helped us to see that the concept of competence with cultures sets up a divide between a normative therapist who is neutral and normal, and a divergent client who is the other. It also quite often focuses on external signs and signifiers that you are doing things properly, rather than necessarily focusing on the therapist and what they're bringing to the conversation, or just the dynamics in the room. I think the way that I really understand this is that we were thinking about people working with diversity, as though diversity is a thing that's over there and we're over here being all homogenous and normal. I mean, possibly not in this room, but you know. But you've got then moving towards the idea of working within diversity, we are saying all of us have different experiences and we are working together to co-create something rather than trying to appear competent with working with an othered group. This has brought us to kind of shift some of those original concepts from the cultural competency to move from cultural awareness to curiosity, really understanding what your client is bringing to you. Moving away from this idea of attitude to difference to cultural empathy and being in that with the person. There's the term there of cultural attunement, which is what I shifted at the start towards. And then rather than looking at adaptation to accommodate this other weirdo that you've got in the room with you, looking instead at how these two identities can work together. So I've taken these two diagrams from Myra's book, which was published last year, and you can see the difference here between the two, where at the top you've got working with diversity, you've got this separation between a normal counsellor and a divergent client. And then if you drop down into the working within diversity side of it, it's much more systematic and systemic. You're looking at the power in the therapeutic relationship and the process, and looking at the intersectional identities of both of the people who are in the room. So where are we now? Our group is small, but we are gradually becoming a bit more reflective of the diversity of experiences of ADHD and autistic culture. Personally, I'm really glad that we brought our work to a halt to give us space to refocus. And as a result of that, our next step is going to be to have a reflective session with all of us who are currently participating to think about our identities and positionality in relationship to this, and then think about where we want to move on to next. In terms of where we're going with it, all of us on the group have been thinking about this as a bottom-up change rather than a top-down one. It would be lovely if training bodies and membership organisations would prioritise having more in their syllabuses about working with autism, ADHD, GSRD populations, all of that stuff. But that's not really where we're at the moment, and that feels like a long fight. So what we are hoping to do is to come up with some guidance to help people reflect on how they learn about their autistic and ADHD clients in the therapy room with them, and understand their cultural experiences as a way of challenging neuronormativity in the therapy room. We're still interested in bringing people along on this journey with us, so if any of that has struck a chord with you and you think you'd like to be involved, my contact details are there. As I said, I'm going to be around all day. We're meeting monthly at the moment. We're doing an hour once a month. And we're just looking for some more people who can help to broaden our perspectives, but also share this work with us. I just wanted to take a second to thank the people who've come along on this journey with me so far. It's been fantastic to have these people involved. They've helped both with well, not helped, we have done the work jointly together, but they have personally helped me in hopefully making sure that this presentation was reflective of the work that we've done so far. And if you'd like my references, my contact details are there. I'm quite happy to send them through to you. And that's me done. I don't think we've got a lot of time for questions, but what we do have a think again about, are you the person who definitely needs to speak on this, or do you just need to tell me that I'm brilliant after the session?
You're brilliant.
Thank you. Oh, we have a question at the front.
What I was making was an observation, and as a very visual person, what I saw or what I was kind of impacted by is the kind of visual images of people on there, and whether or not that kind of represent different people, different body types, So there's something for me about the representation. We're sort of presenting something that actually it's kind of easy to kind of just draw down images that are easy to kind of find on the net, and I think that's something that is a constant for me. It's like, well, actually, who does that invite if the images don't look anything like me?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And yeah, I think it's something that we can all reflect on in terms of making sure that whatever material we are producing is reflective of a wide range of people so that people can see themselves reflected in that.
I congratulate you on a great presentation. Thank you
you.
very much.
Thanks, everyone.